Welcome back to the Old Soul Millennial channel. In today's video, I'd like to share with you my chainsaw gear. We're going to start by discussing what I have in terms of PPE, so my helmet, my chaps, the first aid kit that I carry on my chaps at all times. We'll dive into that kit, what I have. I'd also like to share with you my thoughts on my equipment, what I like, what I dislike, what I would like to upgrade to, and the reasons why. From there, we're going to transition to this case. In this case, I have common wear components and maintenance items such as replacement chains, caps, some files, scrunches, and there's also a pretty unique tool that I recently acquired. It's called a bar closing tool. We'll talk about that tool. So first, let's talk about hard hats. Now, the hard hat I rock is made by steel. This is a woodcutter model, plastic. It's okay. Now, when you look at the fellers out west, they have those aluminum hard hats with that nice wide brim. It is beneficial in that it offers better sun shielding. Additionally, it helps to protect your neck and shoulder areas a bit better from debris. Like, you look at this plastic steel hard hat and the sides are flat. It doesn't flare out. But the reason this doesn't flare out is because you have these drop-down hearing protectors. So there are benefits and drawbacks to each. Now, I'd say this helmet weighs maybe a pound. It's pretty light. There are some things I dislike about it. For one, I dislike the suspension system. So for the suspension system of this helmet, you have these nylon straps, and it's not very comfortable. You have a little bit of padding right here in the front. I find that those nylon straps like to pull out my hair. You may notice I have some hair thinning going on, and I think that's partially from this helmet. So something I've added to help correct that and make this helmet more comfortable is I've riveted on a piece of yellow or green cotton, whatever color you want to call this, and this serves two purposes. For one, on those really sunny days, and I don't mind pulling out a few hairs, I can just drop this down. It provides a little bit of sun shielding on the back of my neck, makes things a little bit cooler. But on the days where there's not much sun and I want to provide more protection for the top of my head in terms of comfort, I just kind of use this like a liner. It helps keep a little bit more hair in my head. Now, what I like about this helmet, for one, it has the drop-down shield. Here on the East Coast, we deal with a lot of prickers, a lot of vines, things of that nature. We're cutting through a heavy, thick brush, and having a face shield, in my opinion, is just absolutely necessary. Another thing that I really like about this helmet is that it has the drop-down hearing protection, and in my opinion, here on the East Coast, it's absolutely necessary. You have a face shield that drops down and the hearing protection. So, you West Coast guys, you look pretty cool with those aluminum hard hats, but here on the East Coast, we have a bit of a different environment. So this steel woodcutter helmet does offer some good benefits. However, the suspension system just needs drastic improvement for me to approve it. So thus, I don't really like this helmet too much, but it does the job. Next, let's move on to my chaps. So I am not sure what brand these chaps are anymore because the tag is so worn out. They do the job. They're not the most comfortable. And additionally, these really don't provide the best protection. So in terms of strapping the chaps onto my person, we have these clips. I find that these clips with this nylon webbing, they tend to loosen up throughout the day, so I constantly have to tighten them up. Additionally, another thing I really dislike about these chaps is on the bottom portion of my leg, these are not what's called full wrap chaps. So you'll see the more expensive chaps, they wrap completely around the lower portion of your leg, from the knee down. And I think that's a critical safety feature because if you accidentally tap your leg while that chainsaw is running, at a higher RPM or throttle, what could happen, the chain actually could grip onto your chaps and spin the chaps around, thus exposing part of your leg. So having a pair of chaps that is full wrap, that wraps completely around your leg, is the way that I would recommend you go if you're in the market for a pair of chaps. But I have these. I'd like to upgrade, but they do the job for now. So you'll also notice to my right, I have my first aid kits. Now, first, in the front, I have a tourniquet. And I think it's absolutely necessary that you carry a tourniquet on your person at all times, especially if you're felon alone. It's been a little while since I've used this, but the idea of a tourniquet, if you're alone in the woods and you accidentally cut open an extremity, you don't have much time. So it's critical that you stop that bleeding as soon as possible. And it's good to practice applying this tourniquet with one hand. So this is a cat tourniquet. This is one of the higher end tourniquets. So it's going to take me a minute to get familiar with its operation, but you would slide this over the extremity. Right, there's a strap. Pull this tight, pull the Velcro strap tight. doing this kind of slow so you can see it on camera too. So I'm going to turn this up to have it face you. So now this is tight around my arm. And from here, we have this lever. So what we're going to do is we're going to twist this lever. And you got to get this sucker tight. It's going to hurt a lot, but if you're in shock and you're worried about losing your life, you know, you got to do what you got to do. So what happens as you turn this, it's tightening up this strap around your arm. And then once you get it tight enough as to where the bleeding really stops, then you lock the lever into this slot right here, thus hopefully stopping the blood flow. And then there's a final strap that you would slip over this holding portion right here. And there's a time mark right there. So if you do remember, try and write down the time or remember the time when you applied the tourniquet, which honestly most people are not going to remember to do, but it's going to be helpful for the hospital staff if they have an exact time as to when you applied the tourniquet. It helps them make the proper medical decisions. But again, have a tourniquet on your chaps, have it readily accessible, and practice with it. Get familiar with it. Take it out from time to time. Again, practice that one-hand operation. It might just save your life. So behind my main tourniquet, I have this secondary first aid pouch, and I kind of forget what I have in here. I think I have an Israeli bandage, some other heavy bleeding supplies maybe. So this will be a good refresher for me as well to see what I have in here. First, I want to talk about this first aid pouch. Now, if you don't have a lot of money, or if money's tight, there are ways to get what you need by being creative. For example, I made this first aid pouch maybe 10 years ago out of an old piece of fire hose. I just riveted the bottom so nothing would fall out, riveted on a button, and it's still here today. You know, as for the red and white, just added some blue painter's tape, a little bit of red spray paint I had laying around, and voila, you know, first aid kit. For the belt loop in the back, this is another piece of discarded fire hose that was just going to get thrown out anyway. Riveted right on there. I mean, it's really simple to do. So, we open this up, and what I'm seeing, well, for one, this is something I don't like. I have a little piece of line I got to cut to ensure that doesn't obstruct anything. But I also have, apparently, a second tourniquet in here. It's in the plastic, so that might not be the smartest thing to do because I would have to rip this out of the plastic if I absolutely needed it. But what are the chances I'm going to need two tourniquets? I suppose it's possible, but unlikely. Aside from that, a pair of trauma shears. This is really important if I need to cut off some clothing to access the area that's injured. What else do we have in here? Also have some compressed roller gauze. And there are tear strips, so that'll keep this clean and a bit more sanitary. And finally, we have the Israeli bandage. So the Israeli bandage is a pressure dressing. It's self-contained pressure dressing. So if I had a wound that was bleeding heavily, but I felt didn't require a tourniquet, I would grab for the Israeli bandage. So it's basically a self-contained pressure dressing. There's like a pad and roller gauze, and it kind of locks into itself. So it allows you to apply pressure to a wound without having to hold on to that wound. You know, it's just a self-contained thing, locks onto itself, and it's just fantastic for bleeding control. So that's all I have in the secondary first aid kit, you know, really designed for heavy trauma. So the tourniquet, Israeli bandage, some roller gauze, and trauma shears. You know, you got to keep these kits somewhat lightweight, and I would recommend you gear them towards heavy trauma, right? Don't make the mistake of going out to the store and just getting a cheap first aid kit because all you're going to have is Band-Aids and Neosporin in there. When you're going out in the woods and you're cutting with a chainsaw, you need heavy trauma first aid gear. So this is just some of the basic stuff that I carry, and I think you should at least carry this as well. The final bit of safety gear I want to discuss, of course, aside from having safety toe boots, is my eye protection pick. So this is what I wear in conjunction with my felling helmet, my chainsaw helmet. These are made by 3M. These are sunglasses. Of course, they have non-tinted lenses as well, but oftentimes I'm usually working out in the sunlight, right? So it makes sense to have sunglasses. So these glasses have an anti-fog coating on them, which it works relatively well. You know, about 90% of the time, no issues, but 10% of the time, they fog up a little bit here or there. But what I really like about these glasses is they have this foam gasket material in between the lens and my face. So this really helps to seal the glasses against my face and prevent dust and other debris from getting into my eyes. So these are definitely my #1 pick in terms of safety glasses. All right, now let's start going over everything I have in this box. I'll cue in some B-roll footage of the camera facing down into the box so you get an idea. But basically, I just grab this box whenever I have a job where I gotta leave the workshop here. And this pretty much has everything I could need for my saws, as well as some other tools and equipment. So keep some wedges in here. Now this, I really wanted to share with you. I did a short on this. I'm not sure if the short's coming out first, but this is pretty cool. So this is a chainsaw chap for your forearm, and where you would want to use this is when you are using a top handle chainsaw with one hand. So I'm going to show you how this kind of works and why you may want to consider purchasing one. So here we have a top handle chainsaw, and the reason it's called top handle is because your controls and the handle is on the top of the chainsaw as opposed to the rear. These saws are much more dangerous, and they are only recommended for professional arborist use. These are so much more dangerous because you have less control over the saw, because you don't have a handle back here to control, you know. So if you have both hands on the saw, they're only maybe 4 or 5 inches away from one another, so the chances of kickback are much higher. But additionally, this is extraordinarily dangerous because you're going to operate this saw with one hand. Not recommended, please don't do that, but sometimes arborists do this because you have to do what you have to do. So if you're operating this saw with one hand, chances are you're controlling a section of trunk or a branch with the other hand, and this leaves your other hand quite vulnerable, especially if you don't have much experience. And that's where a set of arm chap, well, an arm chap really can protect you. So say you're holding onto a branch and you slip and the bar goes right into your forearm. This will in fact bind up that chain and hopefully prevent any kind of injury from happening. You can see how much protection it really provides for your hand. It's well designed because there's a little cutout that allows your hand to still operate as it needs while providing as much protection for the top of your hand as possible. So there's 2 little strings here that hook into your pinky as well as your thumb, and any kind of top handle chainsaw work, you want that extra layer of protection. Would be really smart to invest in one of these forearm chaps. So, really cool device. So I do have a bleeding control bag, but the contents of this case are actually within the first aid kits on my chap. So this is just an empty bag, but I have it in case I want to add some things, additional pieces to my first aid kit in the future. Where do we want to go from here? So I suppose next we'll move on to chains. Now when it comes to chains, I like to keep at least 3 spare chains for each saw. Reason being, when Hurricane Sandy came through, I remember that you could not get anything. You couldn't get chainsaws, you couldn't get chains, you couldn't get bar oil, heck, you couldn't even get regular gasoline. So Hurricane Sandy has definitely left an imprint in my mind that I need to be prepared for situations. So that's why I always like to keep at least 3 spare chains on hand at all times. Now, the chains I buy, I like full chisel chains, and I like to buy at least 3 at a time. And I just find the cheapest chains that I can find on Amazon, and I've never had an issue. With that being said, these chains probably won't last as long as a steel chain, but it'll be very close, you know. These will probably last 90% as long as a steel chain. That's my rough guess, but I have 3 chains for the 261 and I have 3 chains for the 193T. I keep them separate, obviously, so it's easy to find them. Coffee-wise in the morning, I like to drink chock full of nuts because I really like the steel cans. And when you finish up the coffee, you have these wonderful steel cans, and these are just fantastic for storing parts and bits of hardware. So I use these all around the house, including my chainsaw equipment case here. So I have 1 can labeled parts, and I got a few spare parts in here, like an extra spark plug. I think this is a fuel cap for the 261. There's some other engine components in here as well, bar nuts. There's a decompression switch for the 261 in here. So just any spare parts that I've collected, I'll keep them in this can. You never know when they may come in handy. So I have another coffee can labeled tools, and I believe these are more engine rebuilding specific tools. So in here, I have a low profile 10 mil, and this is for removing the carburetor off my 261. I have a Torx driver. I think this came with my 261, so for taking the head off and things of that nature. Also small flathead. So really these are more engine rebuilding specific tools. Wrenches. So every now and then I'll lose a scrench, so I thought, you know, it'd be a good idea to purchase a few extra screnches. So I bought a 5-pack of cheap screnches on Amazon. They're okay, but they are going to require a little bit of modification. So the socket ends are fine. They fit onto the bar nuts, no issues. Work on my 261 and my 193. However, the flat end side, where you're using the flat end to adjust the tension of the chain, brings the bar in or out. I found that they are too wide, so what you may have to do, you may have to grind down the sides of the flat end of the scrunch just to allow them to fit into that receiving hole on the bar cover, so you're able to actually adjust the chain tension. So it's not a big deal to modify these, but that's just something to look out for if you decide to purchase a big kit of cheap scrunches. Aside from that, this container is kind of like my go-to container for miscellaneous tools. So I have two different size files, of course, one for my 261, one for my 193. I have a flat file for filing my depth gauges. Obviously a few different scrunches. I have my depth gauge filing tool, which pretty rare that I use this. I normally kind of do it by feel, but you would place this over your cutter teeth, and then this lowered flat section, you would position this over your depth gauges, take your flat file, and then just ensure that your depth gauges are set as to where, there's no contact with the flat file when you have this over the teeth. The other thing I really like about this depth gauge tool is on one end you have this thin little hook, and this is perfect for sliding it down into the bar channel and removing all that gummed up schmutz, getting it out of there to ensure that your bar oil can fully lubricate the bar all the way around, thus reducing heat, friction, and wear. I also have a couple of cheap little brushes. So before I hit my saw with the compressed air, normally I'll knock off the big chunks of debris, on the inside of the bar cover with a flat end on my scrunch. And then I'll take one of these brushes and just kind of brush off all the loose sawdust, try and get as much out of there without using compressed air as possible. So these brushes come in handy all the time. Also, I use these brushes around the caps, right? Like the fuel and oil caps. Like right now, there is a good bit of debris on these caps, right? Like you can see all that sawdust. So as opposed to just hitting it with a compressed air, or where compressed air isn't available, you can take one of these brushes and you can actually knock off a fair bit of the sawdust. And this is a good idea because it helps to reduce the amount of gunk that gets into these tanks, right? You should clean these tanks out once a year. Personally, I've never done it, but I probably should. But again, just having a little brush to get all the schmutz away from the cap is a smart thing to have on hand. And I also have a very small piece of copper that I've custom fit. This is actually a carburetor adjustment for, I think I have a home light saw that I got for free. It requires a very special key to adjust that carburetor. Since I rebuilt that, since I replaced the carburetor on that saw, I purchased the correct kit, but sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. You make the tools that you need as you need them. So another thing I had in the bottom of this box was an extra dog for my 193T, and this is something I want to discuss for a moment. So when I first bought this saw, it didn't have steel dogs. The spikes that are on the front of the saw right next to the bar. Let me tell you, not having steel dogs to bite into the wood, it was just awful trying to use this saw. So if you do get a saw, definitely consider adding some type of steel dogs. Because what those dogs do, when you're cutting through a piece of wood, those dogs dig into the bark and they allow you to pivot the saw, thus using the leverage behind the dogs to really power into the wood. It really gives you a ton of leverage and it makes your cutting time a lot quicker. So without those dogs, you don't have the ability for the saw to really bite into the wood, thus you don't have this fulcrum point. So as opposed to pivoting here, you're taking your whole body weight and you're trying to push this down, especially if you don't have a sharp chain. But having steel dogs on your saw is just so important in my opinion. I can't live without them now. That's why I added them on my 193T. They sell cheap dog kits on Amazon. That's what I got for this 193T, and I've never looked back. And the final thing I have in this kit, I just did a video about this tool and it was quite popular, is a chainsaw bar rail closing tool. And these cost about $25 on Amazon. And what it is, you have a set of bearings. They're adjustable so you can adjust the set in between the two. You have a pulling handle, and this handle right here adjusts the set between the two bearings. But basically what this does, your chainsaw bar has a little rail in which the chain rides. Over time, that rail starts to expand out and your chain starts to rock on your bar. And when that happens, it becomes dangerous because it increases the jerkiness of your saw, increases the risk of kickback, but additionally it decreases your cutting efficiency because as opposed to just cutting in a straight line, your chain will wander from side to side, so your kerf, as opposed to being the single width of a chain, and it starts to become wide and jagged, and it's just not what you want. So it's really important that your channel remains pretty tight as to where you don't have much rock in the chain. So as those rails flare out, you have two options. You could either replace your bar, which a replacement bar, depending on your saw, could be, $40 to $100 or even more than that, depending on what quality bar you get, what manufacturer, the deal. So by investing in one of these $20 tools, you can in fact close that rail back up and increase the life of your bar. I would guess that you can increase the life of your bar probably 3 times with this tool. So the video I did on this tool, I ended up closing the bar rails on my 261, and a replacement steel bar for that saw is like 60 bucks. So this being only $25, it already paid for itself. So this is definitely something you should consider investing in at some point in the future. And that concludes today's video on my chainsaw equipment and gear. I'm planning to take the camera outside after this video, and I'm gonna try and mill my own lumber with my 261 without a chainsaw mill. I don't have an Alaskan chainsaw mill, don't have a bandsaw mill. I'm just gonna take my 261 and try and eyeball a couple of boards because the boards for the ramp on my shed are rotten and I don't wanna spend any money on lumber. So anyway, that concludes today's video. I'd like to thank you for watching. I'll leave links for some of the products you've seen in today's video in the description down below. And as always, I will catch you on the next one.